Let's begin with the meditation. Becoming more present, feeling the body more fully. Let the breath relax the body and mind. Now see your body surrounded by a field of white light. It's an egg-shaped field extending roughly equally on all sides, and above and below. The white light surrounds and permeates your physical body. The white light is filled with all the colors of the rainbow. It has different qualities. Nurturing, sustaining, healing, and protecting both your physical body and your personality. See and feel this light, providing vitality, but soothing, calming, balancing. While this field of white light persists, see your solar plexus and the region around it covered with a ball of blue-white light. It's about 1 meter in diameter. So it completely fills the middle of your torso, extending up and down and out all around you. It's cool, vibrant, peaceful blue light. Feel it having a calming effect on your emotional nature. Wish for harmony and peace in your emotional body. While the sphere of blue light remains, and the egg-shaped field of white light remains, see the blue light also extending out throughout your whole body, filling your physical body, and extending a small distance beyond your physical body. Calming, nurturing your physical body and your emotional body. Wish for peace and good health to your personality. Feel the peaceful and harmonizing effect of white and blue light. And now see the smaller sphere of rose white light surrounding your heart. As you breathe, the light grows brighter while remaining very peaceful and loving. It's a warm, rosy light, the warmth of compassion. Now, in the spirit of blessing, see the sphere of rose white light expanding, filling your room, the building that you're in. The area surrounding you. Spreading out over your entire surroundings, your countryside, or city or town that you're in. Bathing everybody, all creatures, plants, physical world, and the subtle environments that all interpenetrate, bathing everything in love, peace, and goodwill. See the rose light expanding farther. Many miles or kilometers, dozens, hundreds. Boundless source of love emanating from your heart, expanding out. Let it bathe your whole country and region in love and blessing. Wish that all beings find inner peace. That all beings awaken to love. And seeing the sphere of rose white light expanding, let it now encompass the entire planet. Bathing all beings and the planet itself in light. Wish for peace and harmony on earth. While the blessing remains, see the sphere of rose white light growing smaller now, gently coming back. So it's a sphere of light surrounding your heart. Ready at all times to share love, and vitality with all that you come in contact with. Continue to see the body surrounded by the field of white light, suffused with blue light. The particularly concentrated sphere of blue light around the solar plexus and rose light around the heart. Feel your physical body more fully. Center yourself more fully in your physical body and the physical environment. And when ready, open your eyes. We've talked somewhat already about various ways to bring about emotional healing and transformation. What the nature of emotion is, components that make up emotion, and how one can, in fact, work with different aspects of our emotional nature and experience and bring about transformation. We focused a bit on especially the aspect of desire and aversion and how these are very important components of emotion, and how by changing our own desire nature, we change the kind of emotional reactions that we have. And we can also heal old emotions by transforming or neutralizing the desires or aversions that are the sort of vitalizing components of emotion. But we also noted how there are other aspects to emotion. Another important aspect is the story or the mind component. There's always some kind of, even if fairly simple, sometimes it's not very complex, sometimes it's much more elaborate. There's always some kind of, actually various dimensions really of a mental and sort of understanding component. These can be as simple as informational aspects. You know, for instance, if we have an agenda about a particular issue, and then we gain information that's relevant to that issue, that can influence, generate an emotional reaction. So changes in our perspectives about life, changes in our understanding of ourselves, of the world around us, and just changes in essential spiritual understanding of life impact our emotional nature. One of the most, so we can say, by the way, that one way to summarize that is, as we develop more wisdom, as we develop a deeper understanding of life, our emotional nature transforms. We generate less and less person-centered emotion, and we tend to heal past emotion. And so one of the most simple ways, in addition to, say, for instance, a practice where both during periods of sitting, as well as, of course, during day-to-day life, if we cultivate a greater sense of acceptance of things as they are, not a passive going along, but just a quality and ability to personally be at peace with the nature of reality as we experience it. So more equanimity, more detachment, that quality of presence itself not only diminishes emotional reaction in the moment, it heals past emotion as well. Cultivating alternative responses too, greater motivation that's based in love and compassion and deep spiritual aspiration shifts our emotional life and heals and transforms it and reorients it towards more refined feelings that ultimately culminate in being pervaded by compassion and contentment and inner peace. So wisdom manifests in two main ways. It manifests in the qualities of presence that we feel, because these qualities like equanimity or acceptance or contentment or compassion aren't just sort of like energies like electricity that we turn on and off. They are ultimately generated by our understanding of life, by our level of wisdom. The deeper our understanding, the more contentment we'll have, the more equanimity we'll have. In fact, there are types of practices that are purely based on observation, where we don't necessarily even attempt to cultivate specific qualities like equanimity or peace, for instance. Instead, we investigate, we observe, we cultivate a detached awareness that tries to be objective and simply. So, there's a couple of key qualities. We try to be present, try to be aware, and we work towards a sort of sustained and increasingly unbiased perspective. And that will generate a penetrating intuitive insight in moment to moment into what we're experiencing, what's arising, which is wisdom. And that wisdom that's naturally generated all by itself. It's not about trying to kind of replicate something that we read or heard. We're not studying a teaching, for instance, and trying to, we're actually going into a state of clear, sort of bare attention, pure intuitive awareness, just discovering what do we discover about life and about ourselves when we do that. That process will lead to a steady unfoldment of wisdom and illumination, and that illumination will transform our nature, liberate us from personal reactions, from our attachments and aversions, from all the emotions that come with that, just naturally. All of that will just sort of gradually heal and unravel and transform through pure wisdom, through deepening of wisdom. So that's another I'm talking about a particularly pure version of generating wisdom, but it's fundamental to the path, like whether we do that in a very pure and direct way or it happens indirectly through other types of practices. It's always part of our spiritual development that wisdom will deepen. And the deepest, most liberating, most profound type of wisdom comes from the quality or depth of our pure awareness, our capacity to be present and notice increasingly deeply and intuitively what's happening. So that's another way to talk about a radical transformation of emotion, is through wisdom. And all the other complementary spiritual qualities, like aspiration and discipline, and concentration and equanimity and compassion, generosity, love and peace, calm, and all of that will naturally arise in our experience through the unfoldment of wisdom. So I'm not advocating that particular path. That's, if you kind of emphasize that, we just call that the path of wisdom, and that's a style. But since ultimately everybody will develop some degree of all the spiritual qualities on the path, wisdom will necessarily be a component of every path. It's that quality, it's one of those very fundamental qualities that's so foundational, because it's integral to even just understanding, what are we doing? Why do any kind of practice? That part of our nature that makes choices in how we behave, or what we think, what practices we engage in, what relationships, it's all based on wisdom. So wisdom is always a part of the path. It's very fundamental. And I'm using that as an example of another approach. And before, we kind of talked a little more about emphasizing qualities like contentment and acceptance and equanimity. Wisdom is another style. One of the most important, and incidentally, as the webinar goes on, we'll continue to talk about other approaches, other facets. But for our purpose today, one of the areas that I wanted to talk about is the notion of self, which is also a key component of every emotional reaction. There's always a sense of self in every emotion. And it's a sense of self that deep down has, as part of its sense of identity, a feeling of, I am a separate being. I'm not complete. Now, these aren't necessarily conscious thoughts or even subtle, deep feelings. If we get to know ourselves, we discover that there's an aspect of our nature that feels this way. That's always part of human nature and always present until we attain full enlightenment. There's some part of our nature that feels separate, and that as a result of that sense of separation, it feels a sense of lack, feels a sense of not feeling whole. And this is key to where emotions are born. Out of that sense of not feeling whole comes desires. How will I become whole? How will I be happy? How will I take care of this sense of lack? And this is a very deep foundational element, so we don't necessarily consciously live with this under, but to some extent people do. It's sort of built right into our language when we talk about how we feel, and we go through different things, relationship situations, and plus positive and negative experiences, feeling positive feedback from. There's implicit or sometimes more explicit a sense that we all share of lack, of need. And truly, if we are deeply present to ourselves and investigate our experience, we'll find that there's some part of our nature that feels that way, unless we're a master. Mastery is the state of overcoming the sense of lack. That's one way to define it. A person is not completely done with that state of mind until they've achieved full God consciousness, because that's the opposite. God consciousness is the result of overcoming the sense of being a separate being. I think I saw some comments flashing by. Let me look real quick. Linda or Johnny was asking, do you all have a good internet connection today? So are people finding that is my image, my talking or video freezing or having problems for anybody? Raise a show of hands if that's the case. No, there's one. Rippy. And I guess Linda or Johnny. Okay, no problems here. So I think that's probably more on the end of individual users then. Okay, thanks. Okay. So another aspect of transforming emotion is that aspect of awakening, which is also not only ultimately realized in its essence in our state of consciousness, our level of wisdom. What is our true nature? Who am I? But also takes form in the way that we more concretely express. What behaviors do we engage in? What kind of motivations do we feel? As all of that transforms, not only our essential self-consciousness, and by the way, even our souls, the so-called higher self, people use the word in different ways, so we'll get more specific. The soul that is that part of our nature that experiences reincarnation, experiences remembering our past lives. This is a part that in a sense has its home in a higher dimension and remains super conscious to most human beings. It's something that we don't become aware of until we start to become more spiritually sensitive. We might have moments as ordinary people of tapping into that level of our nature. So this is a part of our nature that is evolving spiritually through incarnations, remembers our past lives, and it's harvested wisdom and character development, virtue. It's growing in its spiritual qualities. This is a very refined and advanced part of our nature, and yet deep down in its essence, it hasn't achieved full self-realization yet. Until it matures to such a degree that it merges into its essential essence, its non-dual essence, call that the Atman, or its spirit, or Buddha nature, or Rigpa. There's terms from various traditions, of course. But what that part is experiencing is full self-realization, the realization that one is not at all separate from other beings or the universe. One is radically interdependent with all life. One with Brahman, one with God, one with Buddha nature. Even our deep soul nature is not fully in that state. That's what it's seeking to achieve through these incarnations. So to fully transform our emotional nature is a deep undertaking. And it isn't achieved, to put it in stages terms, it's not achieved until the fourth and fifth stages of initiation or awakening. So we must be patient. It's a deep, prolonged process of healing, of spiritual growth. But we can reach a turning point that's very powerful where we begin to center ourselves more in a sense of wholeness. Like in the meditation we just did today, as we progress in practices like that, we gradually open to a feeling of greater peace and wholeness as we do the practice. And sometimes that wholeness will be more inner, in the sense of like our state of awareness and presence will feel more at peace, more awake, more calm, more whole. But maybe our emotional body will be agitated, and so we'll be kind of, with that, we'll be spaciously open to being aware that that's happening. We may even, we will eventually get to a stage where we won't just feel wrapped up in that. We're able to kind of, in a sense, separate ourselves into two parts. A part that's more awake, that's more soulful, it's more conscious, and a part that's still a human personality and has emotional reactions, has less than ideal desires and aversions and reactions and judgments. And we can increasingly, in a sense, separate ourselves, not in a judgmental way, not in a rejecting way, just in a space of openness and detachment, where we are centering ourselves more in that wholeness that comes from accessing deeper contentment, deeper awareness. And so that it tends to generally grow gradually by just a deepening. And the intermediate phase that it's sort of like one of the big mileposts along the way, is getting increasingly to that stage where, well, I still have a personality. It still needs healing or transformation and enlightenment, but I've shifted my relationship to it. I no longer believe that that's what I am. I have a personality. I'm willing to be responsible for my personality. I love and accept my personality increasingly. I'm increasingly able to heal and guide my personality, but I know, I have a deepening inner intuition that that's not essentially what I am. I'm a state of spiritual presence. I'm a soul. My deeper nature is intrinsically whole. I'm in touch with an innate goodness in my being, an innate positivity that comes from that wholeness, where I feel loving and kind and accepting, but also powerful and responsible and capable. And then from that stage, we just keep deepening not only our ability to identify more and more completely with our soul nature and realize ourselves as souls, but to bring about a transformation of our personalities so that our personality gradually comes into deeper and deeper harmony with our soul nature. Eventually, they merge, in the sense that we no longer have a lot of karmic elementals, desires and thoughts and judgments and painful or memories or nostalgic memories where we wish we could relive the past, or we're fearful of the future. All of that kind of normal human stuff that fills our personalities and our subconscious. All of that gradually is calmed down and transformed and healed, purified. And as that happens, our personality becomes more like a mirror and reflects our soul, and it resonates and is in harmony with it. But to get to that place, we go through an intermediate stage where we have to kind of separate into two beings. We already are. It's not like we're creating that separation. That would sound kind of like going backwards. Like, isn't spirituality about wholeness and integration, harmony, oneness? And yes, in a very profound sense, that's an important aspect of what spirituality means. So it sounds kind of, counterproductive, or like we're going backwards to talk in terms of recognizing ourselves as at least two natures, to keep it simple, really. But what we're really doing is we're not fostering that separation, we're acknowledging it. And we're acknowledging an inevitable, inescapable part of human spiritual development, which is that not all of our nature awakens exactly at the same rate. And so as one part awakens and we increasingly identify with that part and experience ourselves to be more soulful in our nature, we'll recognize that there are other parts of ourselves that don't experience that. This is part of human life, even on an ordinary level, in the sense that, let's say you're having a conversation with somebody and they say something that's rude, and a part of you wants to retaliate, say something rude back to them, and you catch yourself and you say, you know what, that's not gonna accomplish what I want to accomplish here. That's not very kind. It's not going to be helpful to me or that person. Not going to do that. In that moment, we're experiencing that basic dualism of human nature. And in this case, in a positive way, in that we're able to identify with the more awakened part. So this becomes an important aspect of our emotional development, is to increasingly stop identifying with our emotions. In a very unconscious and instinctual way, it's human nature to just kind of feel like, I am my emotions. These are my desires. This is what I want. These are my likes and my dislikes, my preferences. These are my reactions to when I get them met or I don't get them met. And as we develop spiritually, we awaken to this other way of being happy, this other orientation to fulfillment, to wholeness. Call it self-realization or nirvana or God consciousness. They're all different ways of talking about awakening to, developing an attunement to, and ultimately an identification with another aspect of our nature, a truer understanding of our nature. That is about how we've always been. It's about our intrinsic goodness and wholeness now as beings that we always have as our innermost nature. We learn to get in touch with that as the source of happiness, as the source of wholeness, as the source of all the things that we have projected outside of ourselves, looking for love, looking for peace, looking for beauty. We become those. When you become something, realize it's your true nature, and you can't lose it. It's reliable, it's sustainable, and it's a more complete form of it. Whenever we project it outside of ourselves, it's not only iffy whether we can get a hold of it. Inevitably, that style creates sort of lesser versions of it that are imperfect and are temporary. So a more complete experience of beauty, harmony, peace, happiness, wholeness is available through self-realization, or conversely call it God consciousness. Or it's all the same thing. They're just different aspects of the same reality, spiritual awakening. So as we shift that identification, we learn to tap into qualities, even just simple moments where we can relax, or even during day-to-day activities, and bring a little sense of, say, contentment into that moment, just remaining calm. In that moment, we are able to experience a deepening sense, that a deepening connection to our inner nature, our soul. So as we do that, that's kind of a foundational aspect of the spiritual path. We're learning to recognize our soul nature and to identify with it more and more. And then from that space, we find a new relationship to our emotional life. Generating new emotions tends to calm down gradually. And of course, we have to be patient because we're not going to, our ability to do this will be imperfect for long years, even lifetimes. But we will make progress. We will gain greater composure, greater wisdom, greater identification with these inner qualities. And then we'll find too that there is this whole, little microcosm we were calling it the other day, the world that we've created out of our past thoughts and desires, plans and tensions and emotional reactions. It's a field of energy that that fills our personality, our subconscious and conscious awareness. And that deepening state of presence that we're cultivating, that soul presence, will also bring about a healing and transformation of all of that karma. In fact, one of the famous lines from Bhagavad Gita, which is very powerful to reflect on, is Krishna says at one point, and all, this is a paraphrase, all human karma is capable of being healed and worked out within you. If you've wronged somebody in the past, maybe in some life that you don't even remember, you don't have to keep reincarnating till you track that person down and then right that wrong. Somehow be kind to them and balance it out. That balances karma too. But it would be an exhausting and very time-consuming effort to track down everybody, balance out all your karma with them. That's not how most of that happens on the spiritual path. Internally, all of the karma and the elementals of those past relationships, say, since we're speaking particularly about emotions, all of our emotional karma with everybody that we've ever had emotional contact with or reactions to and relationships with, all of that karma can be worked out internally. Because we're relative beings, because we're at a particular stage of spiritual development, because there's wisdom and lessons to be learned from enacting our lives and being engaged and talking with people, we don't work out all our karma internally. Some of it gets played out in our lives, and we meet people and we do things and we heal relationships and we forgive each other, and different things happen over time that also express transforming and enlightening our karma emotionally and in relationship with people. And that, a significant portion of a lot of our emotional karma is relational karma. That's a big place where people have, of course, we have emotional reactions to all kinds of things, but relationship is a big part of that. So, but increasingly on the path, as our power of presence deepens, and ultimately, invariably at some point, the depth of our capacity to meditate deepens, it's possible to engage in practices that radically transform our karma, our emotional karma, and our relationships internally. Part of the value, by the way, in doing it that way is that it's much more efficient. We can awaken to Christ consciousness much more quickly if we don't demand that we need to physically enact every act of reconciliation and balancing of karma with everybody that we've ever been in a relationship with. That's very tedious. We can do much more value and make a more positive impact more efficiently on the world if we work that out more efficiently internally. Also, not everybody is ready to heal and transform at the same rate. So there's some relationships where we can heal our side of the karma, but the other person isn't ready to. So we don't necessarily want to wait around to grow and heal our aspect of that karma for the other person to be ready to also. We have to just kind of move on ourselves. And a lot of reconciliation, or a lot of healing and resolving of emotional karma in relationships is about accepting whatever happened, forgiving people, forgiving ourselves, and being willing to feel fully the karmic implications of what happened. Let's say if somebody hurt us or we hurt somebody else, we have to be willing to fully feel that. A good example, by the way, of that comes to mind of kind of accelerated and powerful version of that healing is some of you may be aware of a famous near-death experiencer named Dannion Brinkley, who famously few decades ago had a very rich and unusual near-death experience. He's become a kind of somewhat well-known teacher and healer since then. But he had been in the military, I believe it was during Vietnam, had assassinated a lot of people. And even before that, he was a very belligerent person. Even as a child, he got into many, many fights with people and was just a very aggressive personality. And much of what he did was done very much in a spirit of aggression and ill will towards people. And then when he was older, he was struck by lightning, died, had a powerful near-death experience, and then was resuscitated and went on with his life. His near-death experience was multifaceted, enough to fill a good portion of the book with a lot of the details of what he experienced. I'm sure some of you have read this, but for those who have, remember that aspect, and for those who haven't, there was an aspect of the near-death experience where he was given to relive his life experiences, kind of the life review that's a classic component of some people's death experiences and near-death experiences. And so he felt, as I remember, as he passed into this altered higher dimension during his near-death experience, he was enveloped by a compassionate presence that then kind of guided him to re-experience all of the negative karma that he had engaged in during that incarnation, all the fist fights he had gotten into. But what he needed to experience, what he was guided to, what this experience kind of drew him into, and he was compelled to relive, was not just the experience in a personal way, but rather to completely identify with the other person and to experience fully and emotionally what they went through. And not only that, but the ripple effect. So if he was a bully in school and he beat up somebody, he experienced the humiliation that that person's family felt when the kid came home all bloodied, and how that rippled out into that person's life. He would go through all of those waves of suffering that he generated, and spinning through hundreds of experiences like that in a very consolidated pattern. He's relived all the mourning of all the people that he assassinated in Vietnam, and families, its impact on other soldiers, and just the vast ripples of effect that all of that had. He went through this excruciating, accelerated reliving of that. Of course, time is different in these other dimensions. That's one of the reasons that we can accelerate our spiritual, psychological, and emotional healing in altered states that are generated by things like meditation, or in this case, a near-death experience. Time is not the same, so you can fully relive in real time, ordinary human physical time, an event, but it can take just a second in sort of subtle time, you might say. It's kind of accelerated time experience. It's like almost like a virtual reality that you can enter into. So he went through all of this in less than a half an hour, probably no more than in Earth time, maybe 10 minutes. He completely went through this deeply, and it completely changed his nature. He came back out, he was just a reborn person. He was not at all a violent person anymore, and that deep, regret for all that he had done and felt compassion for the people that he had hurt. And so a key part of emotional healing is a willingness to feel the implications of how we're acting. When I'm angry, can I shift into a mode where I can feel empathy for the other person? And what is that like for them? So qualities like accepting our emotions, but also the growing spaciousness of our hearts that develop, where we can empathize with others more, experience from their point of view. And that not only brings about a change in who we are in the present moment, but it also releases the past, and we gain a greater capacity for forgiveness, for reconciliation. And this heals our past emotions as well. And different people will go through that in slightly different ways, depending on our style. Different spiritual paths do emphasize different qualities and approaches. So it's not always the same exactly how we go through all this emotional healing and transformation and illumination. But it ultimately is the result of bringing to our emotional life and emotional karma these deeper qualities of compassion, of acceptance, of contentment. And this facilitates the healing. Even if we don't do anything active. Today we did an exercise that's a little more active. So anytime we build a positive energy, we say a phrase like, may all beings find inner peace, that is an active expression of our spiritual presence. Because it's only our soul that would have that intention. So if we say a statement like that, at least in some small way, we're immediately kind of reorienting and tapping into our soul, because that's our soul that feels that intention. So if we visualize the light around ourselves, we're identifying more with our soul just in the act of doing that. And by visualizing it, we're infusing soul into our personality vehicles, which then brings that vibration, that light, that wisdom, and those qualities into our personality more intimately through statements, through mantras, through visualizations, through physical actions, through breathing practices. All kinds of things like that help to anchor our soul states, our soul presence in our personalities. And then by our karma, our past emotions, our elementals, mingling with those energies, they gradually heal and transform. So that's one of the basic methods as well. You can do it in a more profoundly sort of still and present way, where you just are present and feel deeply, and that will transform your emotional body. Or we can do more active things as well. Of course, in a more complete approach to the spiritual path, we're going to end up doing both. Now, there's quite a few. I'm just going to check for a moment now and see if there was anything other than talking about the connection issues. No, looks like. But I am going to pause now just for a moment, open up the microphones, and just see if there's any comments or questions so far.
I have a question.
Yes, Lars.
And it was it's this why do we have to do it in the hard way? Why can't we just do it in the easy way? Question. I mean, why don't we do it in the Daniel Brinkley way? Basically, I mean, if we when we leave the physical incarnation, we could apparently go and do a lot of karmic healing in a very short time, Why why waste a lot of time on the meditation pillow and lots of conflict solving in the physical life if we can do it in an easy and quick way just after incarnation, then next time we incarnate things are solved already.
Okay, well, that's actually a big question. It's a rich, multifaceted topic. But let's see what we can do to just address some of the important elements of that. In a sense, part of what you're asking is what I would consider to be part of a larger question, which is, what are we doing here at all as human beings? What is this whole idea of human experience about? I'm going to go back to just muting for a moment. The answer for me to that, of course, is that we're spiritual beings having human experiences in order to grow spiritually. And so the next question is, well, why does it look like this? Why do we come into these bodies? Why even certain things like, do we forget? Why does it seem to take so many lives? Or all these kind of questions come up. There's lots of them, really. So I think, to me, Lars, your question is sort of part of that larger context of why does it look the way it does? And are there different ways to do it? Can we accelerate the efficiency of it? A part of that, I want to start with maybe saying a little bit more about Daniel Brinkley's experience. Remember, too, first of all, that what he went through in that experience was excruciating. He just found it, to, in an accelerated way like that, go through all of the, re-experiencing the richness and the multidimensional reality of the karmic implications of everything that he did was excruciating. And that addressed the emotional and psychological components of it. There's still the physical karma. So when he came back into his physical body, the karma of having been struck by lightning was agonizing. He said that the pain was so severe that he could barely stay awake for more than a minute or 5 minutes at a time. And then he would just go unconscious out of agony. And as far as I know, at least as of 10, 20 years later, he still was walking with a cane, still was dealing with physical karma that he was working on. So the physical aspect of the karma was not done through that experience. It's ongoing. But it accelerates it. So that's an important piece to keep in mind of understanding how this works. In essence, what meditation can be is a way to reproduce near-death experiences of that sort, because meditation draws much more on internal states and the capacity to accelerate. In fact, I would generally define spirituality as accelerated evolution, because as human beings, we're already evolving. We're going through lives and things are happening. Even if a person doesn't know, I'm sure all of us have met people that seem very good-natured in spite of the fact that they may not consciously even think about spirituality per se or seek to cultivate themselves spiritually. They're just naturally kind of somewhat spiritual people, because that's just a product of life. And when a soul gets to a certain age of just going through incarnations and learning from experience, people just naturally become more spiritual. So what we actually mean when we're talking about being on a spiritual path, is the key component of what that actually means is we've decided to consciously embrace a curriculum of saying, I recognize what's happening here in a natural way, and I want to accelerate it by intentionally cooperating with that process and implementing it myself. Like I'm going to, for instance, part of what happens in life is that we learn from our experiences. So for instance, if we cultivate the ability to be more aware and present in day-to-day life and pay attention to what's happening and try to be less biased in our interpretation of what's happening, just objectively be aware what is going on. Well, that'll accelerate our spiritual development because we'll just notice things more quickly. So meditation is taking that, is that on steroids, so to speak. It's saying, I'm going to actually slow down my life so much that I'm going to sit still and amplify my awareness and do different things with my intention, my concentration, and my awareness to really accelerate the development of wisdom, cultivation of spiritual qualities, and the healing and working out of karma, and my ability to be of service as well. All of those things grow, astronomically through meditative practice. It's a highly accelerated version. So meditation basically is, this is saying, I think it comes from the Bible and the Sant-Mat tradition that I refer to that taught Shabd Yoga or Nada Yoga. Theirs is a tradition where you do ultimately learn to leave your body and go through experiences on solid dimensions. And in a sense, meditation then is learning to die daily. Instead of having to wait to the end of your life to have a near-death experience, I'm going to have it now. So they would, they actually drew parallels with near-death experiences and says, in this practice, you'll learn to, in a sense, have a near-death experience by your own intention every day when you sit down to meditate. And so it's possible to, but a key component of it is a willingness to suffer. What Daniel Brinkley went through was, he died and was drawn into, we could actually kind of go into a more, you might say, esoteric analysis of, well, like what made this possible for Daniel Brinkley? Does everybody experience that in exactly the same way? That's a whole nother question. I think part of that is the choice that the soul makes and the capability of the soul. Brinkley might have had a lot of negative karma, but there was something that was capable and willing to go through that experience. Not everybody is at that stage. So not everybody will have such an accelerated experience when they leave incarnation of harvesting wisdom and working out karma. Spiritual practice, not only in daily life, but especially in meditation, also prepares us for that and develops that ability. Hence, we have books like the Tibetan Book of the Dead that speak of making use of that, the death experience, the afterlife experience, the dying process, and the after-death experience to drastically accelerate awakening. But those practices are, the ability to do that is based on what practice did you do during your human, the rest of your life. So the spiritual path is certainly not all about meditation, but meditation is the special ingredient, that the most important additional ingredient that ordinary religious practices and ordinary human life don't add. That's that new ingredient where the rate of our spiritual growth is dramatically accelerated by adding this. That's why throughout, for instance, books like the Secret Doctrine, there's a phrase that seems to be probably rooted in Sensar, kind of esoteric language of the great ones that live behind the scenes, the masters throughout the world, in places like the Middle East and Europe and Tibet and India and China. These great ones that are sort of like the most advanced Christ-like or bodhisattvic beings on the planet. One of the terms they use in their language for their, what they've realized and the type of work that they do is they're called Dhyan Chohans or Chohans. Seems to be a kind of composite of Sanskrit, Dhyan, and Chohan, which essentially means like a lord. So a translation of this phrase is a lord of meditation, lord of contemplation, because what they've done is they've mastered the ability to not just be in a physical body and to have the power of action and engagement in the world around them. They've mastered the power of the mind and consciousness to accelerate their spiritual evolution and awaken to their true nature and to enhance their ability to be of service. They're Dayan koans, they're lords of meditation. So throughout, for instance, The Secret Doctrine, a book written primarily by Kuthumi and Moria in cooperation with Blavatsky as the sort of medium, that phrase, Dayan koan, is probably used more than any other to refer to these masters and to the great ones in their lineage and to the goal of self-realization, achieving this state. It's used hundreds of times literally throughout that book and others of that, pointing at the power, significance. And Daniel Brinkley is an example of that, in a sense. By having left his body, he was drawn into an altered state, was empowered by the deeper aspects of his own nature and probably very likely other beings that provided a context to experience in consciousness a drastic acceleration of his learning and his working out of karma. Ultimately, that's what meditation affords all of us, is the ability to master being able to do that on a daily basis. And it can be used not only to heal karma, to develop character, to deepen wisdom, but to dramatically enhance our power of our service. Excuse me. There's a wonderful conversation in one of Sri M's books. Some of you know of Sri M. I've mentioned him before as a modern Hindu initiate who was trained by some of the great ones like the great Babaji that Yogananda talked about, that lineage, Maheshwaranath Babaji and others. And at one point, they're having a conversation about spiritual masters, and the great Maheshwaranath Babaji, an ancient sage and one of these great ones that outwardly, looks like he's 30, 35 years old, but is centuries old. He was saying, there's really basically two kinds of masters in the world: those that are kind of out in the world and more known to humanity, initiates at different stages, and then there are those that are more hidden. And then he added the comment, and generally the hidden ones are the greater ones, the most advanced. And then in another context, he took that further and he said, he and Sri M were talking about service, I believe, and in being engaged in the world, and what people do after attaining self-realization and so on. Maheshwaranath commented, and there are those that prefer to remain silent because the mind is so advanced and inner consciousness is so advanced, and because you enter into a state of non-dualism where you transcend distinctions of physical and non-physical, or action and inaction. In a state of consciousness like that, great masters can use their consciousness and affect changes in the world just by the power of their thought. That's far greater than anybody in a physical body can do through physical action. So the greatest servers in the world are often completely unknown to the world because they're changing the world with their consciousness as Dayan koans, without any kind of outer recognition, because they're not having huge followings of thousands of people or starting movements or organizations or any of these things. All of that's important work, and in fact they empower other people to do that as well. But the stage they've reached, they can inundate the world with love at a depth and profundity through the power of their consciousness that even transcends any of those kinds of physical activities. So all of that's possible through deepening our capacity to enlarge our consciousness, deepen our consciousness, and identify and express these qualities internally. And then we keep that in balance with our particular stage, because all of us have human personalities. All of us have a kind of natural way. So we don't want to idealize something like that and say, well, that sounds wonderful, so I'm just going to meditate all the time and stop being out in the world or engaged in the world. That only works in that way if a person is ripe for that. You have to grow into that, and there's a natural balance at every stage. So for most of us, being in the world, engaging in service, engaging in ordinary life, being karma yogis and performing ordinary activities and cultivating our spirituality in that context is a very important part of the path. But it's very illuminating and powerful to understand that we're capable as beings of eventually developing a consciousness that transcends time and space and these kinds of boundaries, and the power of our blessing, our presence, and our love can be broadcast and infused into the world even greater magnitude through these higher and higher states of spiritual realization. And that's why the vast majority of the great ones that we've heard about through modern transmissions of awareness, going back to even the 1700s, we started to hear, especially in the West, about the existence of very unusual beings kind of behind the scenes. And then into the 1900s, more and more, especially with Theosophy, but other kinds of teachings have come out, Yoganandas, and Shriyams, and Swami Ramas, and multiple other sources, people that I've met as well. Some of us have contact with this community inwardly. Occasionally people have physical contact, but these people represent essentially the most advanced stages of service and spiritual guidance on the planet, spiritual enlightenment, and the majority of them are completely unknown to the world because of the style of how they approach their service. So I use that, Lars, as an opportunity to kind of go off into some other themes there, but I will come back for a moment here to just see if, there we go, unmuted, see if there's any follow-up comment or question too.
Oh, yeah. During your explanation, it struck me that you have earlier talked about that the physical, when we are in the physical body, it's like the physical element is like hard, and you have these qualities like stuckness and hardness and firmness, etc., etc. And then when you leave the physical dimension, you will be in the water element or air element, etc. And that will be much easier to move and change things, etc. So it struck me that maybe a way of understanding this, that it was accelerating his, that Dan Brinkley and others have accelerated their transformation of karma, is that maybe we could say that we are in a dimension where it's tougher. So it's a kind of, we are in the gym and having loads of weight. So when we're trying to lift anything, it's going to be heavy. And is there something to it?
Yes, I think so. In fact, there's an interesting phenomena where generally our initiatory systems, for instance, and whether they're kind of from the more esoteric traditions that I was just talking about, or from others that are more known to the world, that are kind of like the esoteric aspect of other, outer traditions, whether they be Taoist or, Kabbalah or Hindu or Buddhist, etc. There's a notion of kind of working in stages in many of these traditions. And typically, it's a model that emphasizes the notion of starting at the densest level the physical, and then kind of working your way in from there. Sometimes that's been misinterpreted to mean that we're kind of trying to move away from the world. But it's not really, a true understanding of this approach is that it's more like you lay a foundation. Since this part of our nature that's on the spiritual path here is in a physical body, we kind of need to start with where we're at and lay a foundation there. And then our consciousness naturally expands to include other dimensions. But we keep that foundation and we keep integrating the levels as we expand. We don't go away from the physical world. But one of the interesting things that I think is part of what you're bringing up, perhaps, about how that works is through establishing a good foundation of cultivating awareness and spiritual qualities in our physical lives. We gradually gain better facility at bringing that over into subtler dimensions. And because most of us will notice, for instance, that when we dream, for instance, most people aren't lucid in their dreams, and they aren't very able to kind of reason the same way they do in ordinary life, etc. That's kind of odd, because you'd think, well, I'm kind of in my astral body when I'm dreaming. That's supposed to be a lighter body. How come I'm not more awake there? But actually, strangely, it's harder to be awake there, because from another point of view, it's subtler there. So the currents of energy that you're involved in, the strength of passions, for instance, the strength of emotions and feelings on the astral plane are stronger than in the physical body. So it's easier to just kind of get blown away by it all. So you need to develop a good awareness and presence and equanimity in your physical body, and then you can carry that over and wake up on the astral plane. So it's not even really that easy or possible for most people to do that work purely on subtler levels until they lay a foundation of. And then it's kind of like you, through that workout in that density of the physical body, you get the muscles, and then you can start to translate them to subtler planes. So there's a lot more that we could say about that. You're welcome. One of the contexts, eventually, as I've mentioned before, I plan to do a webinar while I'm talking. I'm unmuting again. I'm muting again. A webinar on these stages of initiation, because even though it can be useful to just have a simple model of the spiritual path, and that's part of what the notion of the stages of awakening or initiation are about. They kind of gives us a basic outline of the path. But it also, in a more intimate way, can inform a lot about the nature of spirituality by looking at the different stages and what takes place at different stages and how that translates over. And some of what we were just talking about is more capable of taking place at some of the higher stages of initiation, beginning at least at the second and especially at the third, when it's as if with each level of initiation, power to harness the consciousness and capacity of subtler planes gets greater and greater, and that accelerates our ability to grow a lot more. So let me check here. How are we doing for the time? Yep, okay. Looks like it's a good time to take our break. So let's take our 10-minute break now, and then we'll resume after that. Okay. So at the heart of every emotion is several key elements. as we said, there is a desire element that's part of every emotion. There's also a mental component that has various facets, part of which is our interpretation of things, the story that emotion arises within. Another part of each emotion is a basic sense of selfhood that is a reflection of the state of consciousness that we're in when we generate that emotion. It's who we think we are. It's our self-identity. It's one of the, in a sense, little elements or components that makes up every emotional state. So just as we can transform through wisdom our understanding of the story, or we can transform the emotional or the desire or aversion that's inherent in every emotion, to change that emotion. We can also change the core sense of self that is embedded in every emotion, that carries that sense of need and lack and self-nature. If we transform that aspect by illuminating the emotion, if we identify more deeply with being a soul, a spiritual self in a state of greater wholeness, that state of presence radiates a different signature, a different quality, and each emotion that arises is now imbued with a deeper sense of wholeness. And every past emotion gets reprogrammed with that deeper sense of wholeness, and thereby gets transformed. So let's have a meditation now where we're kind of emphasize more of this, our self-image, our sense of identity and how that impacts our emotional life. Taking a moment to settle in. Letting go of concerns, of thoughts, letting go of tension. Opening more and more, resting more and more completely in a state of calm, aware but content. And even if there's thinking persists, or emotions might be around, or physical discomfort, even in spite of any ongoing activity, or you still can find that inner composure, that inner centeredness. As we settle deeper and deeper into that state of presence, sense a feeling of inner wholeness, We might not feel it in our bodies or our feeling or emotional nature. It might be subtle and deeper within, but see if we can find a place of stillness and wholeness. Here we're just aware in a spacious, accepting way. Here we tap into basic beingness. Just the simple reality of existing. Beyond good and bad. Beyond right and wrong. Here we just are. Let yourself settle deeper and deeper into a state of clarity and wholeness. Just being. By letting go of judgments. Letting go of regrets. Feel that deeper self beneath any layers of ideas about yourself, positive and negative, inferior or superior. Successful, unsuccessful, any feelings of guilt or shame or regret or praise, self-valuing, going deeper into just being, beyond judgments. You might continue to feel the presence, an energy or feeling of positivity or negativity about yourself. Just let those be. They hover around like a layer of feeling around you. Just retreat deeper in and let those be. You don't have to get rid of them. Just want to be aware of them. So just being aware of different kinds of self-image, how you think and feel about yourself. Just including that in your awareness, if it's present, you can sense it. But just being aware of it, a neutral observer. You can let it go. Release its influence on you. Shift to a deeper sense of being and wholeness. Sometimes even a sense of confusion about who am I? Can arise. Just be with that too. No need to fix it. Just be aware. So a particularly evident sense of self, emotionally positive or negative at the moment. Just feel your physical body. And be aware of who's aware of this body. sense how the more you settle into just letting things be, not judging, the more you slowly open to a deeper sense of innate wholeness, beyond emotion, beyond mind. Particularly be aware again of your physical body and surroundings. Feeling the surface that your body's in contact with. And when ready, open your eyes. There's a very essential way that self-image impacts our emotional nature. And that's at a very root level that we've talked about, where when we fall out of a sense of wholeness and interconnectedness into a state of separation, that essential experience generates a state of mind, a state of being, this sense of separation that is the root source of desires and subsequently emotions. But there's also another level where self, the sense of self, and self-image can play an important role in our emotional life. And that has more to do with once having formed a sense of self, a psychological sense of self. But what I mean by that is a sense of self based more on what are, essentially false ideas of who we are. The most basic is the body. We identify with the body. I am this body. But there's also, of course, other images that we can form. We can say, I'm an educator. I'm male. I'm a human being. I subscribe to this philosophy, or I have this preference. We create emotional and desire-based notions of self. We create intellectual and philosophical ideas of ourselves, even if we don't think of ourselves as philosophers. We have basic values and perspectives about belief systems. So a person says, I subscribe to this philosophy, or I'm a Taoist. That can be done in a spacious way where we don't really get caught up in that. And our true sense of self is more expansive and free. Or we can create a real identity out of that and kind of have a personal agenda about that. Gives us a sense of feeling something that's personally fulfilling. Maybe we think that Taoism is a superior philosophy, so we get a sense of superiority from that. So part of this, I am a Taoist, or I am a Neoplatonist, or whatever the philosophical identification might be. It can be spacious and free and open and detached, or it can be something that we plug into. Most of us identify with all of these things: preferences, our body, roles that we have, even objects and things that we own, or if we own a house, if we own a car, clothes, all kinds of things. We form constant references and thoughts in our minds of this is mine, and I am this, and this is my preference. So we're constantly creating just a whole bundle of thought forms that have as part of their nature identification. So since our desires are caught up in all of that as well, first of all, that type of formation of identity is based on identifying with things, whether it's something subtler like a philosophy, or a particular point of view, a belief, a value, emotional preferences and likes and dislikes, psychological thoughts about ourselves, memories, our physical body, physical traits, our history, things that have happened to ourselves. When we form our identity out of saying, this is what I am this body, or I'm this point of view, or I'm this preference, then we've identified with something that's a limited and false sense of self. It's not our true nature. True nature is something more mysterious, more expansive, more beautiful, more whole than that. So we've limited ourselves. We've created like a false persona over our nature. And it's one that leads to sense of separation, because all of these things are fragmentary, partial truths or realities. So we can't possibly feel the fullness and completeness of our nature if we are constantly engaging in false sense of identity. So that's part of the process of creating a sense of separation, which then leads to emotions, because a sense of separation causes a sense of lack, leads to desires, which lead to emotions. And then once having done that, we also complicate it by, having additional emotional reactions that are based, let's say, for instance, if I identify with a particular philosophy, and I get a sense of personal satisfaction in some way out of identifying with that philosophy, and then somebody disrespects or criticizes that philosophy, I can get upset because I think that's what I am. I'm getting some kind of sense of wholeness or identity or fulfillment out of that. So if it gets diminished, what if I reach a point in my life where I realize that I don't actually agree with that philosophy anymore? Then that's going to be a crisis. I'm going to feel upset and strained because I'll have to change my point of view. I die to that perspective, that identity. And maybe I go through a state of confusion, because if I thought that's what I was, part of me thought, I'm this philosophy. I'm a scientific materialist, or I'm I believe in Kantian philosophy or existentialism or whatever it may be. a person could be a scientist and get overly identified with the theories that they believe in. We have political ideas and orientations that we identify with. When any of these things gets challenged, they get we maybe encounter other points of view. Maybe we run into contrary views. Maybe somebody criticizes them or disrespects them. So even at the level of beliefs, there's opportunity for emotional reactions. So it's very important in terms of, calming down our emotionality, finding a deeper sense of wholeness, to have a lighter attitude towards these identities. Yes, it's true on a relative level, I'm affiliated with this body, but I can have a more intuitive and nuanced relationship to my body rather than a kind of black and white identification. But I am this body, the way a lot of people feel, especially in modern times, when there's a wider sort of spirit of materialism in the world, of belief that this is all there is and the body is all that we are. But another aspect of how identity is tangled up profoundly in emotional reactions is we want to feel positive about ourselves. So for instance, if we do something that we feel is a mistake, a failure, a transgression of some sort, we feel shame, we feel guilt, feel remorse. And some of those reactions are kind of amplified by the fact that we can have psychological issues around identity. Let's say, for instance, if we have a challenged self-image where we're kind of always giving ourselves a hard time, we're never good enough, then emotional reactions to, say, a transgression might be a legitimate mistake we've made. Maybe we hurt somebody's feelings unnecessarily. Maybe with, just out of a spirit of revenge or some other less wholesome motivation. Then we notice that, we feel a sense of remorse. There's really two basic forms of feeling regret when we experience a transgression of that sort. One is that if we do cause pain to somebody else, if we actually just open ourselves to the reality of the pain that we've caused and feel a direct empathetic sense of, oh, this is an outcome of what I just did. And I feel a natural disinclination to want to do that. And so therefore a sense of regret, kind of contrition or authentic remorse. That's natural. That's just part of being human. And it's inevitable when we make mistakes. If pain is involved, we'll feel some kind of. But another thing that we do as human beings is we add an extra layer on that. It's kind of like, instead of just acknowledging a mistake, feeling the truth of it, maybe it was a minor thing, and then just letting it go, many of us add more. It's kind of like that's not enough. We have to beat ourselves up a little bit more, make sure we learn that lesson, or it gets exaggerated. It's like, oh my gosh, we make a big deal out of something. And in fact, interestingly, there is a deeper kind of learning that happens that's more organic and ultimately even more intuitive and soulful, where we just experience the reality of what happened. It's karma. Like karma, the deepest meaning of karma is it's not a judgmental system. It's not a moralistic system. We can develop a sort of belief system around it where we try to understand and categorize karma. This leads to this, this leads to this. But living karma in the moment is actually just sort of natural laws at work, whereby we experience the simple natural consequences of our actions. If we act out of anger, for instance, we actually don't necessarily need to have a mental category of that anger is bad, anger is unwholesome, etc. It's not necessarily wrong to have that category, but if we don't need to focus on that if we're moving towards a more intuitive approach to life. What we want to be doing is just being available and open to feeling fully the karmic reality of how we're being. So if we feel the anger in the moment that it arises, and then we feel the action that comes out of it and the implications, the karmic repercussions of the action, if our feeling nature is adequately open and whole and we just feel all of that, two things we'll notice. One is that the anger itself isn't a very pleasant thing to feel. It doesn't optimize clarity. The more angry we feel, the less clear our thinking tends to be. So if we, in a non-judgmental way, if we just observe anger and be very mindful, we'll notice it's not an optimal state. There's qualities of empowerment and capacity to act with integrity and clarity and force that are not based in anger, and that are compatible with wisdom and compassion and spaciousness at the same time, that are much more effective and much more free and much more able to achieve the ends that we have in mind than if we're acting out of a more personal based anger. So we notice these things. Part of what a deeper type of spiritual development is about is not operating primarily out of a judgmental system where we're trying to kind of like categorize everything we're doing. We become increasingly intuitive and able to just sort of be deeply present to the reality of life, our states of consciousness, our behaviors, our motivations, and we just notice it all more with greater self-knowledge, and we see the truth of the karmic realities of it all. So this isn't a point of view that says, any remorse, for instance, that one is feeling as a result of some action that we have engaged in, is necessarily psychologically unwholesome and we shouldn't feel bad about ourselves. Yeah, we shouldn't have an excessive or unwholesome negative reaction to something that we've done that's based on some belief system. That's often counterproductive. It doesn't really help to kind of pile on and give ourselves a hard time. What we need to do is just feel the truth of what was that all about? How did that feel? How did it feel to be jealous? How did it feel to be angry? And what were the consequences? What action did that lead to? And what were the consequences of that action? If we're able to increasingly feel the truth of all these things, then we rapidly, much more efficiently, just naturally mature into a more spiritual person, because it just makes intuitive sense to. It just feels better. It's what we see the wisdom of it from just intuitively paying attention. So that that type of growing intuitive process doesn't completely free us at a normal human level from not having moments where we regret things that we've done, for instance. But it does free us from judgmental, excessive, and neurotic forms of guilt and low self-image and inferiority and shame and things like that that are excessive and unnecessary, and that actually will cloud the learning process, because that will create a fog that gets in the way of being intuitive and really feeling on a more visceral level the truth of what our lives and our behavior and so on, so we can learn from it more directly. And of course, that includes positive states. The more we grow in this way, the more our karma is improving, and the more we feel a sense of building wholeness in the positivity that we're generating in our behavior, in our motivations, in our state of mind. So it's valuable to be able to recognize some of these components of self-image and to kind of move in a more soulful direction and try to get in touch with an important thing to understand about soul is that it's not only a state of feeling, let's say, profound equanimity or profound acceptance of life. These are important attributes. It also is a part of our nature that's capable of recognizing karmic processes, karmic actions and consequences, and reacting to them. Our soul, that for those who are familiar with certain teachings like Theosophy, Alice Bailey, Das Close, and similar systems, there's a notion of a type of more soulful self, what I'm going to just keep calling soul for consistency. It's sometimes called the causal, but something to understand about that level of our spiritual nature is it both partakes in a deeper connection to our true nature, our ultimate nature as being parts of God, but it also is participating in our human experience. It's kind of a bridging consciousness. And therefore, it's sometimes referred to as the human soul, as opposed to, say, our universal self. So it kind of has its foot in both worlds. It's very spiritual, it's very wise, it has a lot of positive qualities. But it also, for instance, when the personality engages in some kind of unwholesome behavior, for instance, this soulful self, even if it's not who we identify with being, it's sort of in our deeper unconscious, will feel the karmic implications of it. Will feel a sense of regret, will feel sorrow. It's not as caught up in it, it has a healthier version of experiencing that. But that's part of how it's learning. It needs to experience the karmic implications of positive and negative behaviors and thoughts and motivations and so on. So there's a healthy version of that type of self-image. In a sense, you could say there's three basic kinds of self-image. What we might call the kind of a false and dualistic sense of self that comes from identifying with the body and with things and with desires and preferences and stories on a more outer and human level, the human personality. And then there is the more wholesome, spiritually awakened and aspiring and evolving inner self. And then beyond that is the non-dual self, the transcendent self. That can be a profoundly healing point of view to learn to tap into as well. One of the things that's deeply influences most people in some way is the judgmental mind and the type of sense of self that is generated by the judgmental mind, the good and bad self. And the ultimate final healing of that part of our nature comes from non-dual consciousness, from God consciousness. Because that's the point of view from which we have the most radical capacity to just see both the true nature of our entire being, but also to kind of integrating that into a relative perspective. We get a great healing, a kind of liberation from being burdened by the story, by our karma. Let me give an example of what I mean. Let's say if we make a big mistake that causes a lot of pain, maybe it happened in a past life, we'll create some distance in time from that, and we'll say 5,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, we did something dramatic, made a big mistake. Lots of suffering arose from it. And we're still deep in our subconscious, we're still healing that event. We're still overcoming the karma and the negative self-image. Some part of ourselves couldn't help but just feel really bad about ourselves from doing that. Ultimately, one of the ways that the deepest point of view, the non-dual point of view, can ultimately helps to illuminate and balance out that perspective is that part of a non-dual understanding of time and space and people and karma and evolution is that it has a kind of paradoxical perspective. Non-dualism, if I were to kind of put it into words the way I understand it, the way that this view, arises for me, is that when looking at time and growth and choices and karma, it's as if that when we look at the past, we can say, whatever happened in the past happened as a result of factors, all of which just simply were what they were. And so everything that happened, every choice, every motivation, every action that took place happened as an expression of past karmic influences and external influences and a whole web of interrelated causes and influences that came together to give rise to that person doing that thing at that time. And the reality is that when we look back at something like that, if we deem it something that was unfortunate, that led to suffering, for instance, a mistake, we can say, well, that's too bad. That shouldn't have happened, is one common response. I wish that I could go back and not do that. But the reality is that actually, at the core of every human being is an evolving spirit of essential goodness and aspiration to be the best person that you can, try to do the best that you can. And even if your outer personality isn't as advanced and it doesn't share those values, it's still on its own level trying to be happy in the best way it knows how. And all actions that take place, all behavior that arises is an expression of that current level of the wisdom of that being. And how it all sort of shakes out in the end as what happens in life, what behaviors take place. And in retrospect, it is from a non-dual point of view, we can say with clarity, it actually couldn't have happened any other way. You absolutely were at your best performance, doing the best you could in that situation. So yes, if the you that knows more now goes back and does a redo, it might be different. But the you that was in that situation couldn't possibly have done it any different, because deep in the essence of every human being is trying to be happy the best way you know how. And that was it. That was the current level of wisdom and character, karmic freedom that you had, and the world situation and the other conditioning influences that all added up to that exactly happening. There was no other way it could have been. Now, as far as the future goes, we don't know what those outcomes will be yet. So there's a sense of freedom where we can say, looking at the future, well, I have to think in terms of stepping up and doing my best, because I don't know what's going to be. So it kind of looks like it's a fatalistic philosophy when we look at the past, because it sounds like, well, things just were what they were and they couldn't have been any other way. It's almost like fate. But that's only because we're looking at the past. Since we don't know what the future holds, that leaves open the freedom of our spirit to try to do its best in that situation. But as soon as that takes place and then becomes the past, when we look back at it, we say, well, that was basically kind of inevitably going to be what it was going to be, because that was our best in that moment. And that as we develop an intuitive, increasingly non-dual perspective of able to see life in that way. It liberates us from judgment. At a relative level, we continue to use judgment in an increasingly loving and wholesome way to make as good choices we can in the future, in the present, and looking towards the future as we can. But the past is liberated from judgment because it's just what was. It couldn't have been any other way. See, as human beings, we want to believe that there's some kind of special ingredient in there, in every human being, that in every situation has the power to make the best choice if only that part got expressed. And so we're all liable for that. Because that didn't happen, because that should have taken place and we did have that capacity. But from a more non-dual point of view, it's my experience and understanding that that's an illusion, that little special ingredient, that magical thing that we want to believe is in there. It is in there in the form of our spirit trying to optimize the situation, but even that's at a particular level of evolution and only has a certain capacity to affect our lives. And that's just how it is. It's doing its best. The personality is doing its best. And everything's going to come together the way it does to result in whatever happens. And that was the best situation. So the way we can learn from the past is we can look at what happened and learn from it. But it's a false interpretation, in my opinion, to believe that it should have been different than that. It's just what it was. That's the road that we came down to get to where we are now, and is the inevitable foundation for everything that comes later. It was a necessary, inevitable stage of our learning. And there's no reason to believe that, there's no reason to indulge in feeling like, I wish that never happened. That could have been different. It was what it was, and it's part of the foundation of our spiritual evolution. There's no avoiding it. In fact, it's very interesting to contemplate the idea, especially in the context of this whole business of kind of understanding our spiritual lives, healing our emotional nature, to consider that from the point of view of many philosophies, certainly certain traditions like Buddhism, the theosophical teachings, the teachings that began with those that we find in the earliest texts from the hidden masters like Blavatsky's works, The Secret Doctrine, and others that come after. There's a pervasive perspective in these teachings. It's not in every world philosophy, but it's persistently part of the sort of the perspective of the deeper great ones that are kind of the elders and the custodians of the human kingdom. That the human kingdom isn't a mistake. It's an intentional environment and opportunity for people to grow spiritually. And that it's necessary to go through the challenges that we go through in the human kingdom, and the mistakes and successes, the ups and downs that we go through in order to gain the wisdom that is the function of the human kingdom to generate. So if we think closely about the implications of that, it's like saying, yes, when we start off as a human being and we begin as young souls and we make lots of mistakes and we have primitive character and generate lots of suffering for ourselves and others, that is part of the plan. That's not something that we're supposed to jump over somehow. That's what our soul needs to be going through in order to gain the wisdom that leads to Christ consciousness. Can't do it any other way. It's built into the human idea. So if we have some part of our spiritual awareness that's learning about spirituality and developing, valuing spiritual qualities like love and compassion and service and wisdom, and then we look back and evaluate things that we've been through in the past and say, that should have never happened. We're kind of actually going against the plan. Yes, that's exactly what was supposed to happen. Those were all experiences that apparently we needed to go through have the experiences necessary to gain the wisdom that is what the human kingdom is all about in the first place. So when looking toward the future, it is our, naturally, of course, we want to move towards applying wisdom, positive qualities, enlightenment to improving our nature and to being increasingly loving and wise. But when looking at the past, we have to be willing to understand that everything that we've gone through, all of the mistakes we made, all the suffering that we've created for ourselves and others, that was a necessary and important part of our path as well. And that point of view, which becomes increasingly something we're able to view as we enter into more and more non-dual perspectives, helps to liberate us from imbalanced and immature and confused forms of a negative self-image that's overly judgmental and inappropriately sort of overlaying on our history and our experience of life too much negativity, too much judgment. Okay, so that's a bit about self-image. I'm going to pause now and unmute and just see if there's any comments or questions at this point. Okay. Okay, well, let's see then. So as we develop more soul consciousness and ultimately even increasingly more non-dual awareness, which as I'll continue to reiterate again and again, this more kind of transcendent mode of awareness that we call God consciousness or non-dualism is not incompatible with the karmic point of view. Now, what I mean by the karmic point of view is that part of our spiritual understanding that's growing in wisdom, that's about seeing the truth of positive and negative actions, of like the difference between being loving versus being focused more in sort of excessive self-interest or anger or jealousy. Simple. I did turn off the mics there, Lars. Doesn't look like any more mics are on at the moment. You hearing anything else, Lars? No. Okay, good. That level of our soul nature that thinks in terms of karma, of positive and negative, of wholesome and unwholesome, seems like can be sort of incompatible with what's often called a non-dual point of view. But one of the mysterious elements of the non-dual view is it doesn't negate anything. It's not a concept of oneness that says that duality doesn't exist. So when I achieve non-dualism, all I see is God and all differences fall away. That's not actually a true understanding of non-dualism. Something more ineffable and mysterious and whole than that. And subsequently, it's possible for our total human nature, especially that part of our spiritual nature that has relative wisdom, thinks in terms of positive and negative, can be functional in ordinary life, can make decisions, can engage in ordinary activities. All of that can be fully integrated with non-dual realization. So a well-rounded spiritual development in a human being includes not only God consciousness, but relative wisdom and functionality in ordinary human life. There's even, sometimes we'll even encounter types of, examples of people who are considered to be spiritual. There's even terms, like the Sufis have terms, for instance, that for people who have become so blissed out by God consciousness that they can't even function anymore. Sometimes they just sort of babble incoherently. They seem to have their own language, or they can barely talk. They're just so overwhelmed with bliss and love and expansiveness that they can't function. They just sort of hanging out. But the Sufis are wise enough to know that this is a kind of spiritual disease. It's an excess. It's imbalance. There's no reason that the God consciousness can't be completely integrated with ordinary functioning. You can just outwardly appear as an ordinary person, talk in the same way. You don't have to have some special vocabulary. You'll notice people who think that sort of God consciousness means no acknowledgement of having a relative individual identity. So you'll find people who will refuse to it, or if they refer to themselves, they'll say the speaker, or this body, or this as if they're separate from it, and it's some illusion that they're not part of. These are all ways that people have tried to develop to somehow figure out how to integrate transcendent, universal states of God consciousness in ordinary human life. But the most mature examples, in my opinion, in the states that I've explored, suggest to me that it's perfectly possible. Like when we hear, for instance, of these very great masters, some of them many centuries old, who have been steeped in God consciousness for centuries, and they're deeply grounded, practical, functional people. They can speak in ordinary ways, they make plans, they make decisions. They even have their subtle, style of being that's distinguishable from somebody else. This is they're not deeply caught up in and identify with it the way ordinary humans are. But they're still, the spaciousness and intimacy of their God consciousness fully embraces and empowers and it facilitates their human nature and illuminates it and transforms it rather than negates it. So it's not a human negating thing. And it doesn't even, at a more subtle level, negate ordinary human discrimination. So it's still possible. Of course, beings like that have a very, very refined sense of karma, so they're no longer struggling with self-image issues or dealing with working out painful karma or feeling a sense of remorse about things that have happened or things like that. But they do still have a kind of very functional type of identity in the world that can work on those levels as well. So as we cultivate these different levels of our spiritual nature and awaken to our soul nature as beings of greater wholeness, a much less sense of separation, an increasing sense of deep, formless freedom, presence. Gradually, this brings about a deep change in our emotional nature too, a pervasive change. Because it, in various ways, just transforms the different dimensions of our emotional life, leading not only to a greater freedom from a tendency to generate emotions, but also a healing of past emotions, whether it be self-image, whether it be illumination. See, if we create an emotion from a state of mind in which we believe that we're a separate being, then that notion of separate sense of I-ness, of identity, that self-image gets embedded. It's like every elemental that we create has our signature in it. Our identity gets imprinted in it, like a little encode. It's like a little chip that's impregnated into that emotion. So whether that emotion stays in our subconscious or it goes as an elemental and it's floating around in the subtle atmosphere of the planet, the way the Lords of Karma know that it's ours is it's got our signature on it. That was every state of the generation of any elemental, including certainly emotions, is imprinted with our identity. And not only is that kind of there as a sort of responsibility link to that, that's our karma, that's our creation, but also it's part of what conditions the quality of that elemental, the degree of wisdom or truth or falsehood inherent in that sense of identity that's impregnated into that elemental is key to that elemental, that emotion taking the form that it does. So as we grow and we re-experience these elementals, these emotions, these past karmic energies in as they kind of circulate through our character, they get, as our state of consciousness changes, they change too. They get transformed by changing these elements of each emotional energy that we've generated. And self-image is one of those components. Subsequently, there's some paths. Let me just pause for a second. There's some, oh, sorry to hear that. Loud ping, pling. That's too bad. Okay, so people are responding. In the same way, we can take any spiritual quality, like love, for instance, and make that a key component or the central component of our path, and kind of follow that to God consciousness. Follow that as the guiding light of our spiritual evolution. There's other principles, and one of them is identity. So, for instance, when Ramana Maharshi taught a basic technique of self-inquiry, that's a technique that's emphasizing identity as the key. If you change that one thing, everything else changes. Desires change, virtues blossom, karma gets worked out. So his method was based on a kind of inquiry into the self, kind of an investigative spirit, where you say, who am I? And you can verbally say it, but you can also just generate it as an intuitive investigation, like sensing the sense of self moment to moment and exploring it, observing it, investigating it. What is this? Who am I? And if you do that, if you sustain that inquiry, your realization of what you are will grow, it'll deepen. You'll pass through increasing, you'll disidentify more because basically this practice is one in which you're sort of by virtue of saying, so what am I really? Who am I really? That's a powerful practice in one sense, because it's essentially saying, well, you know what? I'm not gonna buy into what's in front of me. I'm questioning my experience, questioning my reality. So that starts a process of going deeper. You start to shift away from saying thoughts arise, like you might say, who am I? And a thought arises, I'm an American, I'm a male. I live in Oregon. These are just little identity thoughts. But if you're questioning and you persist in it, it's like you're saying, well, that's not satisfying to me. I'm not buying that as the final answer. I want to keep going. And if you keep going, it'll take you not only all the way into soul states, but ultimately into non-dual realization. And you'll realize your deepest nature as being radically interdependent with all of life, part of God, the Tao, however one wishes to sort of try to put words onto that. So while that's happening, every elemental that's arising, every emotional state, every desire that arises, every karmic impression that you've generated will keep coming up from the subconscious, and you're kind of, it's like a fire that you're generating that's burning through them all and saying, I don't buy it. I'm not going to reaffirm this. I'm going deeper. Who am I really? And then as you get into deeper states and your realization is getting more whole, more bright, more realized, that light is transforming all those elementals. And finally, you achieve a state of self-realization where you know the truth of your nature. And every thought, every emotion that arises in your experience gets illuminated by that truth, by the power of your realization of who you really are, and gets liberated. And it can't hold you, can't pull you back into that misunderstanding. Not only can it not pull you back, it as a karma gets liberated, gets freed. Okay, let me switch to unmute. Yes, Lars.
I read the Arthur Osborne's book about Ramana Maharshi and the practice, and what I was thinking about, I would like to hear your comments about that. Ramana says that practically everything we do is, so to speak, under the law of karma, but except the who am I practice. It's not under the law of karma. So why is that, do you think?
Now, do you say that, can you say, did he, in that context where you read that, because I don't remember that quote, does he say anything more about what he means by it's not under the law of karma?
Yeah.
Now
it's 20 years ago. I wrote the book. I read the book. So, I think it was something about that. Perhaps you said that while you're sitting there, things can happen around you. That will be karma, of course. But how I understood it at that time, at least, when reading it, was that kind of the part of me that's asking, and the one who is kind of I'm asking towards or looking towards, is higher in the dimension, so to speak, higher than the karmic level or something like that. I don't know. So I was thinking if you had any ideas.
Yeah, this is one of those areas where we get into very subtle realities, and people are just going to have different points of view about it. There's much when it comes to mysticism and spirituality where more or less everybody agrees. Everybody believes in the truth, the value of spiritual qualities like peace and wisdom and equanimity and so on. Everybody believes more or less in the value of spiritual practice, and that there's mystical realities at the foundation of the truest level of reality and so on. So there's universal things like that there's other worlds. Almost every tradition and most spiritual teachers agree with that. But then there's also lots of nuances where there's disagreement, partially because we're getting into realities that are very hard to conceptualize. They transcend the intellect. So when we bring it down to the level of language and philosophical and psychological insight, there's going to be differences and problems, challenges. To me, that's probably part of it. It gets into very subtle issues of what exactly is karma, how far does it extend, does it touch all planes, all those kinds of issues. My own, so there's two ways I could respond to the question. One would be to kind of try to identify with Ramana and say why I think he might have said that, and then the other would be my point of view about that concept. I think I'll do a little of both. I suspect that Ramana was emphasizing that there's a certain non-dual perspective about spiritual practice where for instance, Dogen, I've shared this wonderful story about the great Zen master Dogen. For those who are interested, that's just spelled as more or less how it sounds, D-O-G-E-N, Dogen. It's a great Japanese Zen master. And he went through a phase of his spiritual practice where when he was, studying deeply Buddhism and doing advanced practice, he started to become kind of philosophically and intuitively bothered by the question of like, if we're all intrinsically God already anyway, why do we have to do practice to realize that? Why do we have to work at it? Why is it so hard to awaken? If we're all Buddha nature now, if we're all God in some sense, what's the deal with why we have to work at it to realize that? So this became a kind of puzzle for him. And it possessed him so strongly that it became a kind of existential, quest to figure this out intuitively, to crack this puzzle. And he did eventually. He had a very deep awakening. It's kind of one of his many awakenings on stages of his spiritual development in that life. And again, because these truths are very deep, I personally feel like it's probably not ultimately possible to put into words what Dogen realized or anybody else who sort of cracked that mystery. But one of the ways that he tried to put it into words, he said, well, one way to think about it is that it's not that we practice to become enlightened. We practice because that's how enlightenment manifests in the world. Practice is enlightenment. So this way of looking at it collapsed the distinction. So instead of thinking of it karmically like practice causes enlightenment, he just said practice is just enlightenment actualizing in the world. So if you're doing a little bit of practice, that's because you're at the stage where you have a little bit of enlightenment. If you're doing more practice, you're more enlightened. It's not, so from one point of view, you could say practice isn't causing the enlightenment, it is the enlightenment manifesting. So, there's a whole discussion that could go on about that. That's a very interesting whole thing. But it sounds to me like Ramana was kind of taking that point of view with the who am I, or self-inquiry practice. He was kind of saying the innermost reality of the true nature of this practice is it's not karmically the cause of enlightenment. It is the way to tap into enlightenment actualizing. And so it's beyond karma. So that would, that would be, I think, my best shot. My personal critique of both Ramana probably in this case and Dogen would be to say, that's true, but it's half true. The other part of the truth is karma. Karma is always part of the story too. Both can be true at the same time. And that's another mystery. That's another koan to understand how they can both be true at the same time. So to me, another way to look at the self-inquiry practice is it's generated by the desire to awaken, and from a relative point of view, that's an important part of it. Looking at it from the relative point of view, and it's an action, an internal contemplative action that karmically causes awakening to happen, or to put it maybe more subtly, ripens the conditions for awakening to happen. Both of those points of view, I think, are true at the same time. Any other questions or comments at this point? Let me make sure we're unmuted. Okay. So that's kind of a pretty more far out version, you might say, of looking at the whole question of identity and transformation, but on a very practical level, doing the kind of practices we did today, where there's an emphasis on just being more deeply attuned to your soul nature, changes your sense of identity and causes your emotional, generates a kind of field of presence in your personality and in the world around you. But specifically with regard to emotional transformation, generates an emotional field that will lead gradually to not only a change of how you feel emotionally moment to moment in terms of generating new emotions, but also will heal past emotions. So the term I tend to use, that you may have noticed, is I talk about presence. Presence is one of the words that also relates, among other things, very intimately to the sense of identity. So when I use the word presence, it's kind of a catch-all term for all of that, all of the different stages of growing into deepening spiritual self-realization, starting from just becoming a little bit more centered, a little more aware, a little more relaxed and present and concentrated and detached, accepting and compassionate, to deepening and deepening states of that till you get to levels where you have a deep intuitive realization that you're not your body, you're not your personality. You don't reject those things. You can incarnate in that level of reality, but you have a vivid sense, this is not who I am. There's no fear of death at that point. And then even deeper states of presence, it's a sort of a continuum merging into deep self-realization and God consciousness, or a radical level. It's a whole continuum. And as we progress through those stages of deepening transformation of our identity, our emotional life gradually changes with it, both in terms of the emotions that we feel day to day in reaction to more ordinary life events, and healing of old emotions that are still hanging around from the past. So that's the point of view of looking at it a little bit more from the identity point of view. We're going to look at it from a few different angles. We talked a bit about the wisdom point of view even earlier today, about the desire and aversion point of view, and the identity point of view, all of which are components that co-create or aspects of our emotional life and reactions. And as we go on with webinar 2, we'll begin to look more closely at some of the other specific emotions that are challenging ones, especially challenging ones. We've spent some time looking at guilt today, and remorse and shame and those kind of related qualities, particularly the ones that relate to senses that, when we experience and evaluate our sense of self as having made mistakes or being deficient in some way, and some of what goes into healing that. And last time we looked at fear some, so we'll go on with that process of looking at different emotions as well. Okay, well, thank you all for coming today. I'm sure that you all got the mailing. Are there any questions about the issue of the time changes? No? All good? Again, look forward to seeing you all next week.